So everything's all right, Justin?
Yep, everything looks good to go.
Lovely. Okay. I'm just going to write down the time I start and try and make sure I stick within that 15 minutes. So, hi, everyone. My name's Julie. My name's Julie Hughes. I'm a lecturer in occupational therapy at the Australian Catholic University, and I'm based in Brisbane at the Brisbane campus, which is on Turrbal and Jagera lands. So just to acknowledge that and acknowledge elders past and present, and if there happens to be anyone present who is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So I'm going to talk about occupational therapy just because it's one of those things that what is it? So often people say, oh, yes, a bit of OT. So I thought I would kind of start with some of the basics in terms of what is occupational therapy, and also exhaustion management, which is something which an occupational therapist can offer in this space. And I really have enjoyed listening to the other presenters, and I love when there's overlap. Because I think, we're really, we're all kind of talking about the same way of actually working with people with ME. So I'm just going to talk, I've just got a little overview here, talk a little bit about me. That's often the way people start, isn't it? How did I start? How did I get into this? Also to acknowledge Rachel as well, who has been involved in some research with me and some occupational therapy honours students, so to acknowledge them as well. So going to talk about what is occupational therapy, what can occupational therapists do, what are some of the impacts that we're aware of and we talk about as occupational impacts, and what needs to change in Australia to make this happen. So I hope you don't laugh too hard, but where did it start for me? Well, this is me back in 1996, and I had the wonderful opportunity for a year. Unfortunately, then I was getting married and moving, but for a whole 12 months, I was actually able to specialise in working with people with ME and people with chronic fatigue syndrome. So this was called the Chronic Fatigue Service in Leeds in the UK, and I was the first to be full-time. So that was a huge opportunity for me. And as I say, a lot of things have changed since then. And I can see, from these presentations, we have learnt so much in terms of how we talk about ME in a much more informed way. I know change is slow, but there is more acknowledgement of the condition. And we're now seeing far more research and support for people, but there is not enough. And that was certainly what I noticed, having worked in the area clinically and then having done some research as well, is that I noticed that within Australia, when I came back from living in the UK, which was 2017, that there was nothing here. There was nothing here for people with ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. And certainly occupational therapists were not working and are still not working in this space. And that's something that it's my small personal mission to try and change that, along with my previous occupational therapy honours students, to try and make a little dent in this and to try and educate occupational therapists within Australia about how they could be useful to people with ME. So it's my little soapbox, I have to say. So I'm just going to start with what is it? What is it that I do and what is it that I teach to my students? So occupational therapy enables people to participate in activities they find meaningful. So we're a very practical profession. These activities include taking care of oneself and maybe others, working, volunteering and participating in hobbies, interests and social events. Occupational therapy is a client-centered health profession, that involves ongoing assessments to understand what activities you can do and those that you want to do that perhaps you're struggling with, any current limitations, your goals and motivations, and also to offer advice and techniques about how to do something more easily and safely. So you can see how this fits really well if an occupational therapist understands ME in terms of how people can actually manage their exhaustion better. So what can we do? Well, as I mentioned, I was working in the area in 1996, and I know for a fact that occupational therapists have been working in this space since at least the 1990s. So, we really should have come a lot further, and certainly within the UK, as I'm sure people are aware, there are many different ME-specific services, or ME and chronic fatigue services, and usually occupational therapists are part of that specialist multidisciplinary team. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing we need, basically, and that's what I'm going to say. But in terms of an occupational therapist, we are trained to assess and to work with a very broad range of ways in which people are impacted by a health condition or a disability. So we're trained to work with the physical, cognitive, psychological, and the social impacts of disability. So you can see how, excuse me, this is so relevant to people with ME. And that we're very practical. So we offer practical support and problem solving in order to help the person to manage their exhaustion as well as possible, knowing that obviously, it's an ongoing and, long-term condition, and to do more of what they value and enjoy. So basically improving people's quality of life, helping them manage symptoms as best as possible, using some techniques that I'm going to talk about, and also, offering support and acknowledgement to people. And that was something within my research that I did in the past, was that people with ME and chronic fatigue wanted acknowledgement. They wanted people to understand that what they were experiencing was a real thing, and that they were struggling. They were struggling, but that wasn't happening back in the 90s. There was no real acknowledgement, or there was stigma around this thing, ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. So what do we want to do? As an occupational therapist, I want to get to know the person. I want to understand their story, and I want to know what they're experiencing. So similar to, what previous presenters have talked about, it's really understanding that lived experience of for the person with ME. So I want to understand the physical. So what are their symptoms? How is that impacting on them? The cognitive. Kieran was talking about brain fog, and I was madly kind of tweeting about, it's not tweeting, but anyway, you know what I mean, on social media, because brain fog is a huge issue for many people with ME, and really difficult for people to reconcile. That previously they had, they were very, very smart people and still smart people, but really struggling with some aspects of cognitive functioning. The psychological, Victoria was talking about that as well. And that's something, not to say that an occupational therapist is there as a counsellor, but an occupational therapist is aware of the consequences, the psychological consequences of having a long-term health condition or disability. So as other people have said as well, people, feeling lonely, and the social as well. So becoming socially isolated. So people losing that connection. And when I think about the psychological as well, people losing a sense of self. So, we all, by the time we're an adult, we have a certain sense of ourselves. And even, for younger people with ME, they're supposed to have a developing sense of self, and yet they can be robbed of that by ME. So there are many, many losses that people experience, and so it's helping. I need to understand in order to be able to help in any meaningful way, by understanding that person's story. So the things you do. So this is where occupation comes in. So that's just those everyday activities that people do. So an occupational therapist is talking about that when they say occupation. So what are the things that are important to you? What are the things that you actually value? So I need to understand that, as well as what are the things that are difficult? So what are you struggling to do? And what do you want to do more of? So what is difficult, but you actually want to be able to do more of? So I need to develop a picture in terms of understanding what your goals are for what you want to achieve, what is really bothering you in terms of the things that you can't do, and how do you want to use that limited energy that you have. So this is part of my assessment and my understanding of the whole picture. Then there's your environments. So does your environment, in terms of, obviously the home environment, if someone is bedbound or housebound, but also are you able to, if you're not, are you able to access other environments as well or not? Your work environment, school environment, your community. So does your environment support you, or does it cause more barriers? Are there ways that we could work with you to change the environment, adapting the environment, adapting the house, providing equipment, just to make things easier so that things can be done in a way which is safe, but again, doesn't take up the energy that you don't have. So this is really important, is for us, and ideally to see people in their own home environments is the best, but occupational therapists can definitely make use of telehealth. That's really one of the things that we should be exploring a lot more with people, especially if they're bedbound or homebound, and I have had so many meetings with Rachel, and, she takes those meetings, she's able to participate, and she's able to contribute so much because of the fact that we have that technology now, and we're all much more au fait with being online. What are the impacts? Now, this was some research that one of my past honours occupational honours students did. This was Chelsea Bartlett who did this work. And what we were looking at were what are the impacts on people of having, and this was ME, stroke, chronic fatigue syndrome, so we weren't necessarily separating them out at this stage. So the little picture here is essentially the environment shrinking for people who experience ME. So there's a range of different things there, like physical barriers, financial strain, accessing the NDIS or not being able to access, stigma, limited understanding, relationship breakdown, and so on. So many more factors actually causing the person's environment to shrink than factors which were able to open it back up again, like supportive relationships or increasing the understanding for people who experience ME. So this was one of those things where what people were describing to Chelsea and myself was that their world was shrinking. And this is where certainly if someone gets down to being housebound or bedbound, the environment becomes a very small place. Also, that little inverted triangle there is the activities that people reported that they were tending to lose. So there was people had to prioritize, and they had to change the things that they did for survival, and therefore they would stop doing their leisure activities. Then if that still wasn't sufficient, then they would have to stop doing work or productive activities. So perhaps the housework they weren't able to do that. Then there were those activities of daily living, and then finally self-care. So people, in terms of survival, people were often, because of how disabled they were only able to look after their self-care needs. So gradually over time, if their condition did not have any remission or any improvement, people were losing access to their ability to carry out those activities. And there's various things on the side there as well. So people talking about that boom-bust pattern of activity. So people using their activity as much as possible when they've got it available, then having the big crash, which we now talk about as penny or PEM. But in layman's terms, people just experience the boom, they use it, then they have the bust and they pay for it. So as I mentioned, loss of identity, loss of roles like work role, important roles like parenting, being able to play with their children, how people want to, that stigma and social isolation, which other people have mentioned. As I said, lack of ability to access the community, just that loss of being able to participate either in your local community or in the wider society. Lack of health and disability supports. I don't think we should start on the NDIS today, or else we'll be here till tomorrow. And lack of financial supports, which goes hand in hand with that discussion. So in terms of management strategies, again, we would look at that understanding of the person, the picture that I'd gained from the person. And this is where we may well be using some fairly basic strategies with people, but they can be really useful in terms of people managing their exhaustion and also letting go of some of perhaps their ideas about how they have to be or what they should be trying to do. I remember talking to a lady in the Leeds clinic who told me that she felt she was letting her family down. And I said, oh, tell me more about that. And she said, oh, I'm not able to bake bread for them every day. And I was like, okay, wow. Never having ever baked bread. But that was she was obviously a real perfectionist, and that was what she felt was important. And that was important to her because that was something that she really valued. But to me, I was like, oh, wow. So yeah, I need to understand that to work with somebody. But again, I think in the scheme of things, baking fresh bread for the whole family is maybe not going to be a high priority for everybody. So we need to think about sleep, how people use their time and their energy, and that's a little activity diary there, which is something that I would usually ask people to do so that I could get some idea of how they spent what was a typical day like, if there was a typical day, which often there wasn't, but how did they spend their time? What were they actually doing? How were they using their energy? When were they resting? When were they sleeping? How long were they sleeping for? And building up a picture of their activity use. And maybe there were ways to do that slightly differently and manage their energy slightly differently. I've mentioned dealing with loss. There is a lot of loss, and an occupational therapist should be able to be a support person as well. Adapting things. Are there ways that we can make things easier? So I've already mentioned that we might use equipment to make the environment different, but we might be able to adapt the way you do something. So you might think, oh, well, I have to stand to do this activity. So ironing is one of those. Now, I have given up on ironing, probably mostly to do with having worked in ME, is that I decided it was not a good use of my time or energy. So given up on that one. But ironing doesn't have to be done standing up. You can do it sitting down. I mean, that's just an easy way. And there are so many different ways that an occupational therapist can problem solve with you to think about how you could do things differently. Can we change that activity so that it's actually easier for you? And the environment also includes the social environment as well. So can we help people around you actually understand better your experience? Can we give them some education? Can we help them be more supportive to you so that life's a bit easier for you? One of the common strategies, which I mentioned just in the slide before, is energy conservation. So I've just put this one up, and I'm not expecting everybody to read all of this, but I just wanted to briefly mention the 3 Ps, because everyone in the ME community is familiar with pacing, and that's definitely speaking our language as occupational therapists, because we're all about how to grade an activity, so how to make it easier. or how to make it harder if someone's functioning improves. So this is definitely our bread and butter. So everyone's familiar with pacing, but also planning and prioritizing. And these are things that we know that people with ME learn from hard experience over time. But imagine if we could give this sort of information to people very early on in their journey in terms of their experience of ME. So helping people actually make the best use of the energy and their time quite early on, rather than people having to learn these very hard lessons over many years of how to actually manage their exhaustion and how to manage their energy, which we know is limited. So let's do the best job that we can of managing that, prioritizing that, so you can actually do the things that you value the most, rather than the ironing, for instance. Just my little bugbear. So what needs to change in Australia? And this is mainly from an occupational therapy point of view, but we do need some ME specific services, and I would love to see occupational therapists as part of that. We need to educate occupational therapists about how they can be useful to people with ME, because these are all the things they can do, but they don't necessarily know that they could apply all these to ME. So they need to understand ME as well as applying all these really basic occupational therapy principles to ME. And then they could be so helpful to you. Then there could be better outcomes. And as I say, I would love to see earlier intervention to help people actually manage early on in their journey. And then they could also write better functional capacity reports for the NDIS, which would also be very, very helpful. So I'm sure you'll agree with that one. So in my small way, and Rachel is definitely part of this research as well, is that we have been conducting student research, and we've had that one article published, which was Chelsea's work. Then there are 2 articles which are actually coming out soon, which are also looking at how occupational therapists can work with people with ME and chronic fatigue syndrome. And then there are 2 research projects which we were hoping would be presented next. But Nicole and Alex will be able to be part of the Q&A, but they have worked very hard. They've qualified, they're registered and graduated now as occupational therapists, but they have done some lovely research which we need. As soon as all the webinar is wrapped up, we're going to move on to writing that up and getting those published to try and make sure that we're influencing occupational therapists in Australia to actually be able to be helpful to people with ME and or chronic fatigue syndrome. So that is pretty much me. I'm going to wrap up. I hope I didn't talk too much, but anyway, I think I'm okay for time.
No, that's good, Jolie. Oh, cool. That was really good in terms of understanding, I suppose, a bit more about OTs and how they can help in the process.
Yes, definitely.